All right then. Part 4. The sound of a wild snail eating. There's absolutely nothing I can do about the bright light over my head. So we're just going to have to endure the top of my head being shaved off by bright beams of sunlight. Part 4. The cultural life. Here is a quote by Oliver Goldsmith from A History of the Earth and Animated Nature, 1774. Snails are found to be furnished with the organs of life and sensation in tolerable perfection. They are defended with armor that is at once both light and strong. They are as active as their necessities require, and are possessed of appetites more poignant than those of other animals. In short, they are a fruitful, industrious tribe. They have their powers of escape and invasion. They have their pursuits and their enmities. Thus begins Part 4, and on to Chapter 11, Colonies of Hermits. Colonies of Hermits. And of course we have a quote from William Cowper from, quote, The Snail, published in 1731. Where'er he dwells alone, except himself has chattels none, well satisfied to be his own whole treasure. A diet of nothing but portobellos seemed monotonous, so I offered my snail a concoction of wetted down cornstarch and cornmeal. This was the diet suggested in a pamphlet sent to me by the local cooperative extension office. It was a big mistake. The snail overate. It climbed in a staggering sort of way to the top of the terrarium, clearly suffering from a severe case of indigestion. It stayed there for hours, excreting wastes from all orifices. I was terribly worried. If the snail didn't recover from cornstarch indulgence, then how, I wondered, selfishly, could I survive my illness without the snail for a companion? It was a miserable night for both of us, and I resolved never again to feed it anything unnatural. The next morning I was relieved to find the snail moving about normally and following its usual routine. It went off to doze in a soft, mossy corner of the terrarium. A woodland snail is most at home in the soft layer of debris, leaf litter, and duff that carpets the forest. Snails are known as decomposers because they feed primarily on dead matter, thus filling a niche in the ecosystem by returning nutrients to the soil. A special enzyme allows them to digest cellulose, which explained my snail's penchant for eating paper. It is rare for native woodland snails to feed on live plants, but if they do, they usually eat older, deteriorating leaves. Many species love to graze on algae and will munch contentedly on mushrooms, even those toxic to humans. The mycelium, the thread-like part of a fungus that often grows underground, is a favorite food. The foraging of snails is complex. They vary their diets to balance their nutrient intake. Two snails of the same species in the same location may make different dining arrangements. They are intrigued by a new food, but proceed cautiously. After inspecting it with the lower tentacles, they take a small taste. If there are no unpleasant side effects, they will return for a larger portion. Soil is also part of a snail's diet, providing much-needed nutrients such as calcium, which is essential not only for shell growth and repair, but also for egg production. So critical is this mineral that the snail is the only known land animal able to find it by smell. When my caregiver placed a little pile of crushed eggshells in the terrarium. My snail waved its tentacles as rapidly as a snail can, set off at once to investigate and eat. From then on, the eggshell site was one of its regular hangouts. The mussel shell of fresh water was another of the snail's favorite spots. Usually it drank straight from the small basin, but sometimes it climbed right inside, flattening its foot into the shell's pearly contours and absorbing water directly through its skin, a hydration method known as foot drinking. Sounds wonderful. Most snail activity occurs with nightfall's cooler temperatures, or just after a daytime rainstorm, when humidity improves locomotion and replenishes the supply of fungi. Even in the house, my snail increased its activity on a rainy day. During the weeks it lived in the flower pot, it must have been perplexed when I watered the violets, as the highly localized rainstorm never resulted in any fresh vegetation or mushrooms. In the wild, snails generally travel downwind from their daytime hiding places, then find their way home in the morning by following familiar smells. While exploring the crate, my snail had used its homing skills daily to return to the pot of violets, which had offered the only decent hiding place, rather sleeping place. The terrarium, however, offered it numerous hiding spots, and it made use of them all. Older snails may spend their evenings foraging within an area of several square yards, while juveniles might roam 5 times as far, searching perhaps for new food sources or their own territory in which to start a colony. Many snails live out their lives in such close proximity to where they hatch that the botanist A.D. Bradshaw once remarked, "All I can say is, you've convinced me that this snail species is a plant." Colonies of snails are often confined by the natural contours and terrain of their location. A species' microenvironment might be as specific, as site-specific, as a hillside or a valley, or even a clump of leaves drifted against a log, or a damp area between rocks. Populations may number 100 individuals, though they can be much smaller, or, if the habitat is contiguous and extends for miles, much larger. I envisioned a colony of hermits, each off on their individual forays by night, each sequestered asleep by day. When I thought of the distance my snail could travel in relation to its size, my own immobility was stark in comparison, and my life was becoming nearly as solitary as my snail's. As the months drifted by, it became harder for friends to give up weekend time to make the long drive to visit. There were many days when I saw a caregiver for just a half hour at mealtimes, and I was becoming more and more cut off from the world. My bed was an island within the desolate sea of my room, yet I knew that there were other people, homebound from illness or injury, scattered here and there throughout rural towns and cities around the world, and as I lay there, I felt a connection to all of them. We, too, were a colony of hermits. End of the chapter. Chapter 12. Midnight Leap. And a little poem from Kobayashi Isa, 1763 to 1828. Little snail, facing this way, where to now? I remember a summer of better health. Deep into a humid night, I half woke from thirst. Keeping my eyes almost closed to maximize sleepiness, I made my way by moonlight, barefoot, across the wood floor toward the kitchen sink and water. Suddenly, I was high in the air, my body springing up of its own accord, my legs zooming into my nightgown, knees bent. I stayed suspended this way for a long moment, my mind still focused on water, unaware that it had been hijacked. I had stepped on a slug. Oh, these pages are sometimes hard to get apart. Here we go. Landing back on my feet, I was now fully awake, and it didn't take long to figure out why a slug was on the loose. Earlier that day, my orange coon cat, Jacione, J-A-S-I-O-N-E. I haven't come across that name. Jacione? Greek, perhaps? I don't know. Let's call her Jacione. Earlier that day, my orange coon cat, Jacione, must have taken a nap in a cool, damp garden spot. A slug had stuck on the cat's fine, soft fur, as occasionally happened. Well camouflaged, it rode its feline mount into the house at a trot. During her evening bathing ritual, Jacione must have managed to extract it from her fur. A spider she would have pounced on and eaten, but the slug, saved by its slime, was discarded alive. As the sun set, the humidity in the house increased, improving conditions for gastropod travel. The slug made its leisurely way across the floor, unaware that I, a large mammal, was coming toward it through the dark. Though its own weight was less than 1/6 of an ounce, it easily and passively repelled my 100 pounds with its slime and, unperturbed, continued on its way. Were I to encounter an animal as large to me as I was to the snail, Highsmith's giant carnivorous snails of Kuwa come to mind again, what would I do for defense, and how would I escape? I could not think of a single passive human defense method as brilliant as slime. In terms of size, mammals are an anomaly, as the vast majority of the world's existing animal species are snail-sized or smaller. It's almost as if, regardless of your kingdom, the smaller your size and the earlier your place on the tree of life, the more critical is your niche on Earth. Snails and worms create soil, and blue-green algae create oxygen. Mammals seem comparatively dispensable, the result of the random path of evolution over a luxurious amount of time. 3.5 billion years ago, when life on Earth began, the snail and I shared a common ancestor, some kind of simple worm that over time evolved into 2 animal groups, the protostomes, which in the embryonic stage develop a mouth first and then an anus, branched off into gastropods and the species of snail at my side, and the deuterostomes, which develop the same characteristics, though somewhat embarrassingly in reverse order, anus first and then a mouth, branched off into mammals, including Homo sapiens. The snail and I both had a gut and a heart and a lung, though I had 2 lungs to its 1. There the similarities ended. Observing its quirky, telescoping eye noses, ribbon-like teeth, slimy skin, and movable house, it was hard to believe that we originated on the same planet. In 1862, Charles Darwin wrote to the geologist Charles Lyell, quote, "I should think mammals and mollusks rather too remote from each other for fair comparison." End quote. The evolution of a species is shaped in part by its unique history of viral and bacterial pathogens. By rearranging cellular DNA, pathogens can switch genes on or off and thus impact the traits of a species' future generations. That's amazing. Sorry for the commentary. I should keep reading. Louis P. Villarreal, director of the Center for Virus Research, proposes that even common, seemingly benign viruses may have shaped human cognition and socialization. And the virologist Thierry Heidemann has, as well as Villarreal, links viruses to the development of the placenta, without which we humans would still be egg layers. I wondered if there was DNA for other animal traits buried in my own genetic code. We all have some genes that for unknown reasons are in the off mode. Perhaps scientists will someday figure out how to flip these switches and will each be able to choose other interesting animal traits, a tail, striped fur, wings, or even gastropod tentacles. And how, I wondered, did the mysterious virus that had felled me change life inside the cells of my own body? Would there ever be a switch I could flip to instantly restore my health? This was a most tantalizing idea. As I glided further into the dusty mollusk volumes, I discovered that gastropods, which account for 80% of all mollusks, are one of the most successful animal groups. They have existed for 500 million years, surviving or re-evolving through several mass extinction events. They make their home in nearly every habitat on Earth. While 35,000 living terrestrial snail species have been documented, tens of thousands are not yet identified. The majority of these are microscopic, as Ernest Ingersoll points out in his 1881 essay, In a Snailery. Quote, "Some snail species are so minute that they would not hide the letter O in this print." End quote. If we Homo sapiens thought we were in charge of the planet, here was clear evidence to the contrary. The humble snail and its clan have a far older and stickier foothold on the earth than we more recent creatures. It was clear to me that gastropods should make front-page headlines in the New York Times, and mammals, particularly the human sort, should be relegated to the back sections. But then, with its many tooth radula, cellulose-digesting enzyme, and lack of vision, my snail was more likely to eat the Times than read it. With a home range measured in yards and a locomotive speed of a few inches per minute, how did terrestrial snails colonize the world's continents? As it turned out, it was not just my cat that provided high-speed gastropod transport. Tim Pierce, a malacologist, a person who studies mollusks, specializes in gastropods. He tracked the nighttime jaunts of a group of snails by attaching a thread to each of their shells. He discovered one snail was moved alive 27 yards by a shrew, its morning ending more than 3 feet below ground in a burrow. 150 million years ago, my snail's ancestors probably caught unexpected rides on 50-ton dinosaurs. These largest of steeds may have provided fine dining, as fossil evidence suggests that snails enjoyed banquets of dinosaur dung. During North America's megafaunal period, which ended 13,000 years ago, snails may have hitchhiked on giant tree-eating sloths, elephants, and perhaps the fastest of their mounts, the lions, cheetahs, and powerful saber-toothed cats. Yet none of these transport methods explained how terrestrial snails came to colonize islands far out to sea, and this was a problem that greatly vexed Charles Darwin. On September 28, 1856, he wrote to the naturalist Philip Gosse, quote, "The means of transport of land mollusca utterly puzzle me," end quote. And then a few days later, writing to his cousin, the naturalist William Fox, Darwin states, quote, "No subject gives me so much trouble and doubt and difficulty as a means of dispersal to ocean islands. Land mollusca drive me mad," end quote. And clearly they did, for that December, Darwin wrote to the botanist Joseph Hooker complaining, quote, "I have for the last 15 months been tormented and haunted by land mollusca," end quote. The trials and tribulations. As later he recorded in The Origin of Species in 1859, Darwin wondered if a hibernating snail, quote, "might be floated in chinks of drifted timber across moderately wide arms of the sea," end quote. This set him off on his usual method of scientific inquiry, experiments. He filled containers with ocean water and obtained a collection of live, hibernating snails. And here's a longer quote. "One snail was put into seawater for 20 days and perfectly recovered. During this length of time, the shell might have been carried by a marine current of average swiftness to a distance of 660 geographical miles." Greatly relieved by this possible explanation, Darwin confided to Joseph Hooker, quote, "I feel as if a 1,000-pound weight was taken off my back," though he concludes in The Origin of Species, quote, "It is, however, not at all probable that land shells have often been thus transported. The feet of birds offer a more probable method." Darwin's dispersal theories turned out to be right. A snail might attach itself to a bird, settling into the plumage as a stowaway on a long migratory flight. For aerial travel closer to home, a tiny snail has been known to catch a ride on the leg of a bee, or may adhere to materials picked up by an avian nest maker. Stuck to an autumn leaf, a snail may blow along in a storm, its magic carpet eventually landing in faraway terrain. It is even thought that microscopic snails may be swept up by the wind, rising on air currents until they join the fertile bank of animal and plant minutiae that inhabit the Earth's atmosphere. They may float undreamed of distances, finally descending within a rainstorm, the perfect humid landing condition for slime travel and a search for fresh fungi. Millions of centuries of voyaging via animals, water, and wind brought my snail's family to colonize the woods near where I was staying. It was by chance that my snail's path had intersected with a human trail, just as a friend, the sort of friend who stopped for a snail, was passing by. The history of gastropod travel now included the unexpected journey of my own snail, which had arrived at my bedside by human transport. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13, A Snail's Thoughts. Another small poem by Kobayashi Issa. Why such careful consideration, snail? Let me read that again. It's 3 lines. Why such careful consideration, snail? It was certain that my snail was just as aware of the details of its world as I was of mine, and so I began to wonder about its intelligence. I crept through the pages of scientific gastropod literature until I got stuck on the paragraph that describes a snail's brain, which, depending on its species, has 5,000 to 100,000 giant neurons. A snail has memory. It can learn new smells and tastes and retain the knowledge for weeks or months, adapting its behavior accordingly. Here's a quote. Too many people think that snails have no brains at all, writes the malacologist Ron Chase in their defense. Like humans, older snails tend to learn more slowly than younger ones. There are plenty of situations that scare a snail, and even scientists now use the term fear to describe a snail's reaction to danger. In 1888, an unknown author declared in an essay titled Snails and Their Houses that the snail, quote, is by no means lacking in intelligence, but exemplifies the truth of the aphorism that still waters run deep. Lorenz Oken, a German naturalist of the same century, waxed rhapsodic in his Elements of Physiophilosophy. Here's a quote. Circumspection and foresight appear to be the thoughts of the snail. What majesty is in a creeping snail? What reflection? What earnestness? What timidity? And yet, at the same time, what firm confidence! Surely a snail is an exalted symbol of mind slumbering deeply within itself. Even contemporary malacologists seem to be aware of the complexity of an individual gastropod's life. Quote, clearly, to achieve any real understanding of the life of a slug or snail, the whole life history must be taken into account, explains A.J. Kane in his chapter in The Mollusca. And the chapter is called Ecology and Ecogenics of Terrestrial Molluscan Populations. The biologist Teresa Audeserk and Gerald Audeserk note just as respectfully in their own chapter, Behavior in Gastropod Mollusks, that, quote, as investigators themselves learn to think like a snail, ever more amazing feats of snail learning power are revealed. An account of a snail's behavior in a tight situation intrigued me. It appeared in Mental Powers and Instincts of Animals, a chapter in Charles Darwin's manuscript Natural Selection. And here's a longer quote from that. Mr. W. White fixed a land snail in a chink of rock. In a short time, the animal protruded itself to its utmost length, and, attaching its foot vertically above, tried to pull the shell into a straight line. Then, resting for a few minutes, it stretched out its body on the right side and pulled its utmost, but failed. Resting again, it protruded its foot on the left side, pulled with its force, and freed the shell. This exertion of force in 3 directions, which seems so geometrically reasoned, might have been instinctive. Were I stuck in a chink of rock, I'd have tried a similar approach. This raises the unanswerable question of where instinct ends and intellect begins. My snail went about its life, moment to moment, much as I did, making decisions or being indecisive about food and shelter and sleep. If a snail can learn and remember, then it thinks, at least on some level. I was convinced of this, and until someone, preferably a snail, can prove otherwise, I will hold on to this belief. The life of a snail is as full of tasty food, comfortable beds of sorts, and a mix of pleasant and not so pleasant adventures as that of anyone I know. Except for their remarkable romances about which I would soon learn, snails lead solitary lives. Their behavior is considered intermediate in complexity, simpler than that of mammals and insects, but far more advanced than that of worms. I wondered if they communicated with each other at all. In The Descent of Man, in 1871, Charles Darwin recounted the observation of a scientific colleague. Mr. Lonsdale informs me that he placed a pair of land snails, one of which was weakly, into a small and ill-provided garden. After a short time, the strong and healthy individual disappeared and was traced by its track of slime over a wall into an adjoining well-stocked garden. Mr. Lonsdale concluded that it had deserted its sickly mate, but after an absence of 24 hours it returned and apparently communicated the result of its successful exploration, for both then started along the same track and disappeared over the wall. Did these two snails exchange tentacle touches? And if so, what information was relayed through physical contact, smell, and pheromones? Wouldn't a lone snail, given the option, prefer proximity to another of its species to ensure procreation and gene survival? While contemporary malacologists do not believe that snails form any permanent attachments to one another, Lonsdale's account, if true, hints at the possibility of gastropod kin selection, as a snail too ill to make its own petal mucus could travel more easily across its companion's trail to reach food and shelter. Aphid parents living on a leaf transmit vibratory signals to their minute offspring to warn them of predators. And though it was assumed that ants do not communicate with auditory signals, scientists have just discovered that some species utilize substrate-borne sounds. Even if the world of the snail is soundless, this does not preclude other communication methods. The biologist Roman Vishniak was always amazed at the individual personalities of and the relationships and battles between microscopic animals in a drop of pond water. How can any species, even our own, ever fully fathom by what means another species or animal group interacts? I respected my snail's intelligence, so it distressed me to peruse the Cooperative Extension's snail farming literature. Historically, snails have been a healthy food source and a medicinal remedy for nearly every illness, but learning how to fatten them up, especially after the cornstarch disaster, was unsettling. I avoided glancing toward my small companion as I read, fervently hoping that it did not have any sort of gastropod telepathy, and if it did, that it understood that it was most helpful to me alive. The Romans, however, had no such scruples. They placed live snails in Eden-like gardens of lush vegetation surrounded by sinister, water-filled moats, satiating a snail's desires and preventing its escape. Still, were I a farmed snail, I'd choose ancient Rome's fresh organic produce over today's agribusiness diet of chemically raised GMO cornmeal. Farmed snails, unhappy with their lot in life, have found ways to break free. In the mid-19th century, Sir George Head described the single-minded survival instinct of snails for sale at a street market in Rome. "The proprietor," Sir George commented, "is obliged to exert his utmost vigilance and dexterity in order to restrain their incessant efforts to crawl over the edge of the basket and escape." A U.S. Department of Agriculture's Snail Farming Bulletin notes that confined snails may form an aggregate, their combined strength and skills resulting in a breakout. I thought of hundreds of snails packed densely into shipping crates en route to a restaurant where escargots grace the menu and boiling water awaits. With one purpose in mind, they join forces, push up with their muscular heads against the top of the crate, and pop the lid right off, gliding slowly but steadily toward freedom. And that ends a snail's thoughts. All right, chapter 14. This is the last chapter in part 4. Chapter 14, Deep Sleep. Oh, and here we have a quote from Hans Christian Andersen from The Snail and the Rose Bush, 1861. I am going to withdraw from the world. Nothing that happens there is any concern of mine. And the snail went into his house and puttied up the entrance. A snail unhappy with its dining options or uncomfortable with the weather will go dormant. Its heart rate slows to just a few beats per minute, and its oxygen intake diminishes to 1/50th of its active use. Perhaps it was my insomnia, combined with the way my unusable time kept evaporating. But of all the traits the snail acquired through evolution, dormancy seemed to be the very best. Like Sleeping Beauty, a snail may not wake until circumstances are favorable, though like Rip Van Winkle, it may wake into a changed world. During the summer months, if conditions become too dry, windy, or hot, or if food supplies are limited, a snail will go into a kind of dormancy called estivation. It climbs up a plant, tree, or wall to be away from the earth's heat and beyond reach of predators or floodwaters. Finding a safe place, it attaches itself firmly with mucus, usually with the shell opening facing upward, which may alert it to weather changes. Then it seals up its entrance with a temporary door made of mucus. This storm door, or epiphragm, like with a G, GM at the end, epiphragm, protects it from shifts in temperature and humidity. A snail may estivate for weeks or months, or even several years. With winter's colder temperatures and shorter days, instead of estivating, snails will hibernate, sometimes returning each year to a familiar site. In 1835, in his treatise On the History, Habits, and Instincts of Animals, William Kirby described pre-hibernation chores. This is a little bit of a longer quote. Snails cease feeding when the first chills of autumn are felt, and set about their preparations for their winter retreat. Each forms a cavity large enough to contain its shell. The mode in which it effects this is remarkable, collecting a considerable quantity of the mucus on the sole of its foot. A portion of earth and dried leaves adheres to it, which it shakes off on one side. A second portion is again thus selected and deposited, and so on. It has reared around itself a kind of wall. It presses against the sides and renders them smooth and firm. The dome or covering is formed in the same way. Thus it sets about erecting its winter dwelling and employing its foot both as a shovel to make its mortar, as a hod to transport it, and as a trowel to spread it duly and evenly. At length finishes and covers in its snug and warm retreat. Very nice. Once in its form-fitted burrow, rather than make a single thin epiphragm as it would for estivation, a snail set on hibernating makes a thicker epiphragm, and depending on its species and the severity of the winter, it may make several in a row, as Ernest Ingersoll details in his essay In a Snailery. Withdrawing into the shell, the animal throws across the aperture a film of slimy mucus, which hardens as tight as a miniature drumhead. As the weather becomes colder, the creature draws itself a little farther in and makes another epiphragm, and so on, until the animal is sleeping snugly coiled in the deepest recesses of his domicile. These slime plates, explained the author of Snails and Their Houses, quote, act on the principle of double windows, enclosing a layer of air between each pair, and so effectually protecting the snail from the cold. I could not stop thinking about the making of making of epiphragms. Their design is specific to a snail's species and to its local climate conditions. They may be thin and simple or thick and elaborate. Strategically located breathing holes may be incorporated, or they may be permeable to air. There is quite an art to the construction of these little doors, and justly so. Despite their temporary nature, a good door in severe weather makes the difference between life and death for a snail. An epiphragm is also personal, and its statement is definitive. The snail is home, but is not accepting visitors. A combination of increasing daylight and rising temperatures will break hibernation. Quote, "The snail, having slept for so long a season, wakes one of the first fine days of April, breaks open its cell, and sallies forth to seek for nourishment," observes Oliver Goldsmith. While many animals, including some humans, make long-distance seasonal migrations to avoid winter weather, a snail's dormancy methods allow it to stay put, a good thing given the short distance of an average snail's excursions. The French poet Jacques Prévert wrote The Song of the Snails on Their Way to a Funeral, about two snails that plan to attend a service for an autumn leaf that has fallen to the ground. They travel toward their destination, and when they finally arrive for the funeral, spring has come and all is happy again. Even while dormant, some snails... Oh, we're not going to get to read the poem. I suppose it's in French, that's why. Even while dormant, some snails have continued their worldwide adventures. Here from, quote, Snails and Their Houses is my favorite 19th century account of relocated sleeping snails. And here it is. Professor Moore records that he has seen certain species frozen in solid blocks of ice, which have afterwards regained their activity. Snails imprisoned closely in pillboxes for 2 years and a half have nevertheless survived. And a snail from Egypt, fixed to a tablet in the British Museum, 25th March 1846, being immersed in tepid water, marvelously but completely recovered after an interval of 4 years. I wondered what happened to snails during the last ice age, and so I asked the malacologist Tim Pierce if he thought a snail could outglide an advancing glacier. He speculated that some of the larger terrestrial snails might possibly outpace a very slow flow of ice. I thought of a tiny snail with a glacier bearing down on it. As the glacier slid closer, the temperature would drop. In response, the snail would dig a burrow and hibernate, and the glacier would flow right over it. Even a snail couldn't last through a deep sleep of 100,000 years. It came down to this. I envied my snail's many abilities. I wish I could create an epiphragm at a moment's notice and seal myself off from the challenges around me. If I couldn't, like a snail, have strength equal to many times my weight, I'd settle for just getting my normal strength back. If I couldn't glide straight up a wall or sleep stuck to the ceiling, I wished I could at least walk upright with the rest of my species. I wanted to escape from the chink of illness in which I was stuck. How wonderful it would be if we humans with illnesses, could simply go dormant while the scientific world went about its snail-paced research and wake only when new, safe medical treatments were available. But why limit such an amazing ability to the ill? When a country faced famine, what if the entire population could go dormant to get through a hard time in a safe and peaceful way until the next growing season came around? And that's the end of the chapter and the end of part 4. Part 5 is next. Love and mystery. I'll leave you with that intrigue. Until next time.